has pulled up on a bank that they've caught fish, and they show up and there's 3 other boats fishing that stretch of bank. Well, that was always frustrating to me, so I kind of made myself start fishing offshore more and more. And you'll find if you really spend some time offshore and start locating kind of little hidden places and not your typical offshore structure, you'll run into less and less of that, and you'll have it more of it on your own. Now, I know some places like the Tennessee River, which is infamous for ledge fishing, and that's a little bit different. But a lot of the lakes, and we're going to start talking about one particular lake, how I kind of broke it down is Douglas. And I won there and had never seen the lake, but it sets up really well for offshore fishing, as do a lot of those mountain lakes in the Tennessee region, and some of it goes into Alabama, and a lot of the Kentucky lakes fish the same way. But one of the things that I start looking at when I get to a bigger body of water is I just try to break it down into sections. And when we got to Douglas, for instance, one of the first things I looked at was these little feeder creeks. And you can see here, I'm going to show you for an example. I guess everyone can see my screen. Paul, can you hear me? Oh, I hope so. But anyway,
Screen's coming.
You look at a pocket like this, for example, and it's got a lot of little small pockets off of this one creek arm. And those are typically good spawning areas. I mean, you're going to see this anywhere on a lake. But as those fish finish spawning, they're going to start migrating right into the main channel. Well, as they migrate out that channel, depending on how far along the spawn is, whether you're starting into a summer pattern, everybody will fish these points. And that, a lot of people end their offshore fishing by, they're fishing stuff connected to the bank. They may be out there 40 or 50 yards and think they're really offshore fishing, but that's just fishing primary offshore structure. And those are good stopping points for fish, but it's not necessarily a final destination. So as they come out and they'll stop, if you can see my cursor, these are good little secondary points that they'll start staging on, moving in and out. They'll come out, they'll typically move on to stuff like this, but that's still not where they're going to end up. Now, if I was fishing this early pre-spawn or post-spawn, I would want to come out all the way out here. As you can see, these are some big flats that main channel will carry current, bring it across this way, and those fish can easily travel right down these ledges and have lots of small staging areas to build on before they reach this final area. And this typically will stay good for a couple months post-spawn. Fish, as they get busted up, the groups won't be as in big schools as they were, early on, but they'll still be a lot larger schools on these big, like I call it a final destination, but it's kind of where they're ending up for the rest of the season. So this is just one typical spot, but here's something I noticed with a lot of anglers is everybody thinks of offshore fishing as, you get into 20 foot, you get into 25 foot, that's just so deep. But if you think about 20 foot plus, 20 foot is just the length of a bass boat, so it's really not that deep. But the one convenient thing about Navionics is they'll show these contours, and being able to really read your map and look at it and understand what you're seeing is extremely important when you're locating fish offshore. I keep showing this one particular area, and I'm doing this for a reason. Most people will look at this color line, and that's how they'll locate this stuff. And they'll forget about everything in white because their depths are set that this kind of stands out to them. But that's not where it needs to, where you need to start looking or finish looking. When you see these contours in this big flat, like you do here, some of these depths, by the way, are a little inaccurate. Don't pay so much attention to the depth as you do the contour. You look, that doesn't end with where the blue does. This contour can come all the way out to here, and then that will be the final drop into the channel. Now, when I won Douglas, I was catching those fish out of 45 and some out of 50 foot of water. Now, again, that water had been, a little lower and come up quickly, so this fish stayed there for a while. but you can't be afraid to look for that deeper water. Now I'm going to move over here a little bit and look at another little creek. Now this particular pocket, you can see, has several little arms. It's going to hold a lot of fish. It's not something like a major creek that's going to hold, you know, big groups, but it's still got a perfect little point out here on the end, and it's not necessarily this one that's connected to shore. And you're not going to notice this unless you're using an Navionics mapping program, but this point here, as you can see, has a little channel that rides right inside and makes a little ridge right here. These are some of the odd features that you want to look for. Instead of fishing just right up here on top, which is what most people would do if they were fishing this, a lot of times these little guts will hold the majority of the fish. And that's one of the cool things about offshore fishing, is when you really get out here in this deeper water, you can start exploring. You can get over top of them with your depth finder. They're not going to spook like they would if they're in 12 or 15 foot. So you can really take a good look and idle it and kind of see what's laying there. And with, you know, some of our sonar equipment, and especially with these mapping programs, you can eliminate a lot of water in a hurry. Let's move on here and look up in this creek. Now, when you get into a bigger creek like this kind of actually works the same as here, just on a bigger scale. And these fish that spawn back in the back, every one of these fish.
Hey, Jeremy, it's
I
Paul
shouldn't
here.
say everyone, because that's not true. There are always going to be some resident. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, it looks like the screen might have locked up.
How about now? Are we good?
I still got you on Douglas on the original cove there with the point.
No, I've moved on.
Yeah, it's still showing on there. I don't know why.
Let me shut it down and try it again.
Yeah, let's try to boot it up one more time. Had a couple people throwing questions.
Any luck?
Okay, so Corey says he's got it. We're good. All right. Must be just mine that's locking up. Mine, and it looks like somebody else had an issue. Bob Gaston here, so looks fine on mine. All right, never mind. We're good. I got a bunch of people popping up. Thank you, everybody, for popping up that they've got it. Never mind. Keep going, Jeremy.
Okay. We're just going to look here just for a second. We'll move on to another lake. But when you look at these bigger creeks, we talked about this little small pocket. You know, every one of these bass in the spring is obviously moving in shallow to spawn. There's going to be some that's going to reside there for the remainder of the year. But for the most part, most of the bass are going to move back out to the main channel. And again, there's always going to be some fish everywhere, but the best thing to do, especially for me when I'm tournament angling, is to look for the biggest group and the ones that are most aggressive feeding. So when these fish finish spawning, it's pretty easy to see their route when you're zoomed out. I mean, you've got this little white line, which is just the channel, so it's real easy to identify that. But I'm not going to want to stop and fish, say, a shoal right there if it's June. I mean, I'm not saying you can't catch them there. I'm just going to spend my time looking for where the bigger bulk is going to be. And as these fish finish spawning, they're doing the same thing. They're going to travel right out these. They're going to stop on a lot of these little places, but they're going to end up being out here towards the main lake. Now, when you get in this deeper contour, again, you're losing some of this blue line. Now, you can adjust that depending on what lake you're on. You can adjust the color line to show your depths. You know, you can highlight some of these areas. Say you pick 50 foot. You want that contour line to light up to 50 foot, and then you can adjust your chart to do so. But if you can see where have my arrow there, there's a really good offshore point right here that you have close to deep water. It's a flat, it's 46 feet deep, but some of these lakes, especially like Douglas, that's definitely not too deep. These fish will get in 50, 55 foot at times. So you've got a big flat, and right here you've got a little bit of an indentation, and a little small point right there. That's one of the little subtleties that you really got to spend time looking for to get away from what everybody else is fishing. So I hope that's explaining a little bit about the way we would break down Douglas. But we're going to pick another lake as soon as I zoom out here. Lake Erie. I don't know if we've got any. Lake Erie is another one. One of the first times I went up there, we were fishing the Elite Series from out of Buffalo. And I found something that was kind of interesting fishing for smallmouth. It was the first day we were there, it was pretty calm, so you could move around and you could look at a lot of stuff. But it's kind of intimidating when you look at miles of just open water. Well, it would be nearly impossible to fish up there without Navionics. I mean, it really changed how we fish Lake Erie and a lot of the Great Lakes. But one of the biggest things I noticed, if you zoom out, you can actually see how that rock formation is made. Right here you've got a big point with a long rock ridge that runs right through here. Well, the first couple of days I was up there, one of the biggest mistakes I made is I tried to get too specific with looking for a drop. You know, I was trying to think, you know, we're moving on to smallmouth and we're talking about deep water, which is a different animal. But if I was fishing for largemouth, somewhere like this right here, let's say, for example, this is that long rock ridge that runs out. Now, this is probably 300 yards wide, this particular end of this ridge. So, in retrospect, you can see how big the lake is. Let me click back on that. You know, you're talking a 5-mile span right here. So, but anyway, getting back out onto this rock ridge, I tried to fish particular little drops and points and just fish that little very specific area and wasn't doing very well. Well, once I, again, got out of that little deeper or got a little deeper and off of that shallower stuff, I got out here in 35 feet and looked just for rock bottom. I quit trying to find anything specific, but just used my electronics. You know, we had side imaging. You could really tell where the rock was, and it was amazing how many smallmouth you've seen just traveling in packs hunting gobies that were just in that 35 to 40 foot depth, and they weren't spooked. You know, it wasn't like when you're looking at them 18, 20 foot and they're real shy of the boat. When they were in the 35 and 40 foot depths, it was much easier to get over top of them and catch them looking at him, you know, playing video fishing. So when I started figuring that a little bit out, it made Lake Erie much easier to fish in a lot of the Great Lakes. And what I would typically do now when I get on, I'm going to show you another little particular spot. I'm going to give away one of my secrets on Lake Erie. It's the same deal around Pelee Island. You know, everyone that's ever been on Lake Erie knows a little bit about Pelee or has fished it. But instead of trying to be so specific and get out here on these ends, I would get out here and just drift with the boat off of these break lines in 35, 40 foot. And you may go 100 yards, but I would always run into packs of fish. And as long as you're staying on rock bottom in that deep water, you're never far from them. If you find rock, and it's really easy to identify on side imaging. I mean, it stands out. It's self-explanatory. I mean, you can see the rubble, and you can see sand bottom. So when you start seeing that rubble in that deeper water, you're definitely in the right area for smallmouth. And I really haven't found any bad areas in that deeper stuff, especially on Lake Erie when I'm looking for smallmouth that don't hold fish. So it's not a matter of trying to find these little drops, and it's a matter of just finding the rock. So when you're up there and you're looking around, just try that sometime. Try idling some of this. You can see these contour lines and that will identify the rock. So I'm going to move over here just a little bit. Another area on Lake Erie. This is the mouth of the Detroit River. This is somewhere that can get really crowded, and it's typically known in the fall to load up with smallmouth. A lot of the fish from the lake will start migrating to the river mouth and get in that current. Here again, it's one of those areas that gets really crowded. So one of my favorite things to do, again, is get out here a little bit deeper. I still look for some of these little edges. Let me zoom out here where you can see it. You can see right here, here's a little bit of a natural channel coming into the Detroit River. So I would get out in some of this area. Typically, you'll just have to idle. You look around, you'll find some rock bottom, and once you hit a ridge, you can kind of stay on that by using your sonar. You may have to mark it a few times. You know, I may idle 100 yards back and forth until I find those particular little ridges. But when I do, I'll just drift it with the current and try to set up with the wind so I can just stay in it and not have to use a trolling motor and just drift back and forth. So those are a couple of things that help me there. Now we're going to go switch gears a little bit as soon as I can zoom out here. Too far. Okay, now we're getting on to some typical ledge fishing. Kentucky Lake. This is one of the best places in the country to offshore fish. Everyone knows it, and it's kind of a unique deal. When I first started fishing Kentucky Lake, and again, this was pre-Navionics. Navionics has completely changed the landscape of offshore fishing. But you could catch a lot of fish in that 10 to 12 foot, 14 foot stuff up on top of the ledges, but now everybody can see this exact same thing. You can kind of determine where the fish are, so it's put a lot more pressure on it. So it's a perfect time to start looking at some little harder to find offshore stuff. And here's a typical one that I will give away one of my spots here, but this is a really good area. As you can see, you've got a point that comes down, the river is flowing this way. You got the inside channel here, the main river channel out here. You can see this is 35 foot. Most people aren't going to fish that. They're going to quit paying attention to it once they get past these blue lines. This is a really good area. You've got a great channel for them to migrate. You've got current coming this way. You've got current coming this way. And this is one of those areas that will typically have a mussel bed on top of it. And again, it's not going to get a lot of attention paid to it because it's white. It looks like the river channel. Unless you set your unit up different than default, it's not going to stick out. And there are a lot of those really close. You can come right across to the other side of the channel, and you're going to see the exact same thing. Typically, most people is going to pull up. If they even fish out this far, they're going to fish this ridge. But you can come down, and you can see you've got a little bit of a saddle right here. You've got a big flat, and then another little drop with a saddle right here. Now I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more. Now when you idle these, especially if you're using the sonar charts, they are so close to exactly how the actual contour is laying. Now a lot of times there'll be some stump fields out here, but these flats can be really good. And you're getting into a lot less used water. There's a lot of those here. And Kentucky Lake is really unique in the fact that it fishes It's got a lot of the shallow stuff on top, but it's really fishes well deep. You know, a couple years ago we were down there and I was longline, and we were catching about 35 and 40 foot nearly every pass when we found some of these areas. Here's another one. You've got a big long leading edge point that comes down. It's got a little bend right there that can be really good. You've got another saddle right here and a big deep flat. Again, these flats you can idle, you can look for stumps, and typically any of these big flats will have some stumps or some big rock on it. It makes it a little easier to locate them. One thing that I typically try to pattern when you're here is it seems like if you find them on the leading edge of a break like that or a long point, that's how they're going to be set up on every one of these flats. If you find them on the tail end, that's how they'll be. And it, you know, at first I thought a lot of it was dictated, and of course all these fish position are dictated by current. But there are days when just a slight shift in the wind, and it can be east, west, north, south, will put them on a different end of these bars. But I'm going to zoom on out here a little bit and move on up the lake. One thing I like to do too, if I'm coming to a lake that I've never been to, we're going to go over to Bull Shoals. I'll show you. I had never seen Bull Shoals a couple years ago. We had an elite event over there. Didn't talk to anyone, didn't know anything about it. But the way that I kind of break down a lake that I've never been to is I look for an area that has a lot of creeks and just a bigger section of the lake. Bear with me a second. I don't know my geography obviously as well as I thought I do. Beaver, here we go. Okay. When we went to Beaver, and I'd never been on it, I really liked this middle section of the lake, and just because you had two really big creeks, you had a lot more water right here, you had a ton of spawning habitat in this middle, and for me typically I like to fish closer to the dam on a lake because there is more offshore structure. So when you look at a lake and you haven't been there, you just want to visit and you're traveling there for the first time, try to look for an area that has, you know, a lot more options for them spawning. You have big creeks, lots of pockets, something that's a little different on the lake as a starting point. You know, that's typically, doesn't mean that that's where the tournament's going to be won, but it's always a good place to start where there's a higher population of fish. And anytime you have more water, you're going to have a higher population. So some of the things that I looked at when we got to Bull Shoals, again, you can see how these fish are going to migrate. The channels are marked plain as day and makes it kind of simple. When you're there, and you know, when we were there actually, for that particular term, they were just starting to move up to spawn. So there were a lot of fish still staging out. But again, the offshore cover here was all what I call primary. It was attached to the bank. So what I mean by that would be like this point. That doesn't mean you have to fish it up in 8 or 10 foot, but this is a really good point. You're coming off of the main lake, and you have a big split in the creek. So that is a really good holding area. It's perfect for pre-spawn. And I caught a lot of fish actually on this point, but I caught them out here, not up here. They were in 25 to 30 foot. Up here is where most of your people is going to pull in fish. Their boat is going to be sitting on top of them. It's a clear lake, sets up perfect for offshore fishing. And you can see the migration channels right here. This fish will travel right up through there. Great place to hold them. One of the other things that you want to look for, especially on a big, deep, clear lake like this, is a creek. You have this massive channel, and the first creek that the channel swings up against, if that makes any sense. We have the channel swinging this way, so the channel swings right up against this creek mouth. Then it swings back across over to here. So just as a starting point on a lake that I've never been to, I would avoid the creeks that are opposite of the river channel. So if that river channel, and you can see on the Navionics how it kind of swings, the creek will swing right up through here. So this particular area, I would prefer to fish this creek than I would this one. And again, especially early in the year, because most of those fish have spent the winter out there in the channel, you're just upping your odds by fishing somewhere that's closer to the channel where they can move into. Again, kind of this would be an opposite of the channel creek, so not saying I wouldn't fish it, but that wouldn't be where I would start. So as I move up in this creek, you can see some of the places that obviously they're going to stop on as they're moving back into the creek. Channel comes in right here. There's going to be a certain amount of fish that travel right up through here and spawn into this and stop on all these little staging points. Now, again, just like everything else, you want to try to find something that might be a little different. This particular point, most of your fishermen are just programmed to come in and fish right here. It's a obvious big flat point, but you may want to try fishing the bend in the saddle right here, which creates a little bit of a break. You'll be surprised how many fish will set up just to stay away from pressure. You know, they've had several boats over them right here fishing today, so they'll just slide right over. And typically this will make, when you look at some of these points that have a little pocket, it's kind of like an underwater bluff wall end. If you can see, and I think I'm zoomed in enough, you have these contour lines that are fairly open all the way through here. And right through here, the contour lines tighten up. Well, that just means it's obviously a steeper drop, but it's still rounding the bend to this point. And that's something I look for a lot when I'm fishing what, again, I call primary offshore structure, which is just something connected to the bank. You'll have an underwater bluff wall end, and that will change transition right here. So those are kind of easy to find once you know what you're looking for. We'll just zoom right out and find another one. This next point over. If you were going to fish this point, most people is going to look at the land, so they're going to think they're just going to fish right in this area. But this does the same thing. As you can see, you have a little bit of a point right here in this area, then all of a sudden the contour lines really tighten up right here. So those fish that get pressured will slide right off to the side, and they'll stage right here on this underwater bluff wall end. Now there's a couple things though that make some of these better than others. A lot of people, everyone's heard the name transition bank or transition area. Well, one of the keys to that isn't just that the rock changes, but typically the rock changes because there is a change in the material, change in the, when you get a different contour, the rock material change. So when you get this little bit of a steeper bank, you'll typically get chunkier rock. You're not going to have the same gravel that you're going to have here. You're going to have bigger rock. Some of it could be just pure underwater bluff. But those are really key areas to look for that will get passed over. Now here's a big example of it. You have this really big point. You have a roadbed that Navionics has been provided for us to, you can locate that really easy, but you got a roadbed comes across, then you've got a huge transition area. That's going to make a really good underwater bluff wall end. So instead of just fishing all this, which is going to get pounded, you come over here and you can actually keep your boat in deeper water and fish this contour. And you're casting up into here and working this particular contour. That's, again, something that's just not going to get fished a ton. We're going to move right up to this one, the same exact deal. Now this is a little more of a secondary spot. This is probably not something you're going to want to fish pre-spawn. This is more of a post-spawn or really early in the year. But you can look here again. This is where, looking at it, typically you would fish. But again, don't ignore these little, almost every one of these points will have that tightened up contour line, and you'll have a really good area for fish to stage. And there's a couple things that the reason fish are attracted to this. It's just like a steep 45-degree bank or a bluff wall in the winter. These fish can sit right up on top and they can slide down into 40 foot without moving very far of a distance. I mean, they can move 10 yards and change 30 feet of depth. So that's kind of what is attracted to them. You can see the same thing we have right here and right here. And again, those are going to be areas that just hardly ever get fished. We'll move back up into this other little pocket and look for some more. Now, let's look right here. Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, can you hear me?
Popular question that keeps coming up too, if you want to talk about a little bit, is probably about 5 questions came up, is, what type of baits are you using in 35 to 45 feet deep, and what type of presentations are you using?
Okay. Well, that was going to be the last thing, but we'll get to that now, I guess. How many minutes are we, Paul? What are we at right now? Can you hear me? Paul just told me there's several questions coming up about what baits I would typically use. And, up until a few years ago, hardly anyone fished a crankbait in that deep water. Well, long lining kind of changed that. And so you can get a crankbait down to the depths. You can really, it's no limit to how deep you can get it, just a matter of how much line you can hold on your reel. The Strike King 6XD, I can get to about 50 foot, and I'll use 12-pound Cigar Tatsu. Tatsu is about the heaviest line you can use, and the key to that, a lot of people thought when I was getting it to that depth at Douglas that I was using 6-8-pound test. But the heavier line, if you could use 20, would actually be better, but you just can't get a reel to hold enough 20 unless you're using an offshore reel. So what I typically do is when I throw my bait out, I'll troll a motor across the structure that I'm going to fish, and I'll let the line sink the bait. That line is so heavy, once it starts sinking, it'll pull that bait all the way to the bottom. So when you start pulling your bait back in, your bait's already on the bottom. So, you can fish it in 60 foot if you take the time and let the line sink the bait. So that's one of the techniques, and I really like that post-spawn. It's hard to beat a crankbait for the first few weeks when they get offshore and are really starting to feed up on shad. Some of these deeper clear lakes, I typically use a Kitech jig. It's a small, compact tungsten jig that really, that's all I use at Bull Shoals, Table Rock. Hopefully next week at Beaver, that's what they'll be eating. But a Kitech jig, 12-pound test, I can fish it in 35 foot easily. I like the 12-pound with it because it lets me fill it a little easier. Another bait that I really like in some of this deep water is a biffle head with a 3.8 Kitech fat swing impact on it. It's really easy to keep on the bottom. I think it's a little easier using, again, 12, maybe 15-pound Cigar Tatsu. I can keep it and I can just grind the bottom with it. Now there's times where you want to just feel it tick the bottom. Those are two really good choices, pre and post spawn. Now if these fish are getting a little finicky, you get a really slick day, they're not wanting to eat, sometimes you have to get over top of them with a drop shot or even a jig and spoon. A drop shot's never a bad choice, but one of the biggest mistakes I see people make with a drop shot is that they'll go too heavy of a weight. Just because you're in 35 or 40 feet doesn't mean you need to go to a 3/8 or a half-ounce weight. I very rarely will go heavier than a quarter, even if I am in 35 or 40 feet. I use really light line, and you just have to be a little more patient to get the bait down there. But that heavy weight does a couple things that's going to hurt you. One is when the fish grabs it, they will typically feel that weight hit them in the side because it's hanging down, and they'll let go. The second thing that it does, it really changes the action of the bait. If you could see it in a swimming pool, now I'm talking about fishing deep, that heavy weight gets down there and drops it so fast when you pick it up. It just doesn't have the same appearance that it does with a lighter weight. So those are a couple of the techniques that I like to use. I don't think you can ever go wrong with a tungsten or a football jig, a crankbait, and a drop shot. You can pretty much fish all the offshore you need to, unless they're really post-spawn and they're first getting there. Sometimes a Carolina rig is better, just less action. It's real subtle. You can fish a shaky head, although it's a little more difficult to fish a shaky head in that deeper water. So Carolina rig, for if they're really post-spawn, a football jig, a tungsten Kitech jig, biffle head, crankbait. I can cover pretty much any of the water that I need to there. Now if I'm fishing some of this primary stuff that we talked about, pre-spawn, I'm typically going to be throwing a jig, possibly a worm, but most of the time a jig. And if it's real early, they're just getting there, you're on a spotted bass lake too, Bull Shoals is a great place. You may throw a jerkbait. You'll be amazed at how deep fish will come out to get a jerkbait. I mean, it's not unusual to see them on the bottom in 35 feet and use a deep jerkbait that gets down to 12 to 14 foot and can pull them right up to it. Now, they don't necessarily have to see it. They can hear it. So they'll come out of a lot deeper water than you would realize to get a jerkbait. I'm going to move back into this creek at what we were going to talk about. You can see right here a lot of these pockets coming into this one arm of the creek, kind of rounded. This would be something that would really catch my eye. This has a deeper channel coming into it. You got a lot more water. This would be a great place to look for staging fish. You have a point right here, a big flat that they're going to spawn on. They're going to spawn in here. And you have two key areas on that point. Now, we're looking at it on a map, so you have to understand what that would look like from the boat. You would just see this point. And most people are going to fish it, but they're not going to look at their map. They're not going to pay as much attention, and they're not going to fish that little point on a point, and they're not going to fish right here where these contour lines change. And fish will definitely set up right here. You can see as this point rounds, there's another little point right there. That's a really key area. And right there could be a really key area. Paul, are you ready to open this up to some questions?
Yep, I got a laundry list for you here. So the next one
that helped everybody. It was.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I just hope that wasn't too jumbled up. We talked a lot about some of the ways that I look for them. I know that's a lot of information to take in, but hopefully some people picked up on some of the things we're talking about, and it makes it a little easier for them. Go ahead.
The questions was, how about fishing a featureless river system like the Calusa chain for deep water?
Well, that's a good point. I'm going to show you. I grew up on the Ojai and the Kanawha River, which is about as featureless as you can get. So let's look at some things that that we can do there. What I typically do on a river is I fish creek mouths, and I don't fish creek mouths to fish the visible cover. Every creek mouth has some rock that is blown out of that creek. Over the years, there are always some kind of high water flood event that has shoved gravel and wood, and it will stack up somewhere below that creek mouth. I'll give you, for instance, this creek mouth. It's on the Kanawha River. I would look for the fish, and you're not going to see anything on your map but that creek. And a featureless river system is a great place to use your Navionics because you'll see these little creek mouths and drains. Somewhere in this area below that creek, I can guarantee you that there is rock. You can find it with your sonar, and there's going to be fish on a few of these. Now, you may have to run 6 or 8 of them to locate them, but that is typically how I fish a river. And as you can run down this, you can look on your Navionics, and you can identify every one of these little drains. It's real convenient. You can see one right here. You can see one here, right here, here. So it's really, fishing some of these featureless rivers is easier offshore fishing. Now, obviously, you're not going to fish as deep, But where there's less offshore cover available or structure, it kind of simplifies it. So give some of those creek mouths a try. You might want to start off halfway to the middle of the river channel and look for that rock. But if you idle around, you'll find it. Next.
We've got a lot of requests for lakes, so I'm trying to...
I can't hear you, Paul.
Can you hear me better now?
Okay.
Okay, a lot of requests on different lakes, so I'm trying to keep it as generalized as I can for you. One in particular is, well, here's a general question. What is the best way to hold your boat in position in deep water?
Well, the first thing I try to do is envision that I'm fishing it without the water. That sounds crazy, but if you're on a lake and you just imagine, once you look at your contour and you imagine that you're setting on land, it makes it so much easier to figure out how you're going to fish it. If you just view it like you're looking at an open expanse of water, it can be somewhat intimidating. But if you try to remove the water, just picture your boat sitting there like you're in a car, that does simplify it. You just try to move around, look at the contour. A lot of times, if I'm just hunting fish down, looking on a point like that, I won't pay near as much attention to my sonar as I will the Navionics map. And I just glide around doing it like that, looking at the map. And again, there's a lot of variables on there. If you have wind, obviously you're going to need to put the front of the boat into the wind. If you have current, you're going to have to fight that. But the easiest thing for me is to try to imagine fishing it without the water. That's the easiest way to learn to position your boat. Once you do that, you'll kind of get a feel for imagining where you're casting and how I need to work the bait. Do I need to stay a little off of the fish? Am I getting up on top of them? Am I drifting up on top of the cover that I'm trying to fish? So that's typically how I try to position my boat, and it's worked well for me.
Stronger current, Jeremy. Do you still stick with a 1/4 ounce weight, or are you increasing the weight of your drop shot?
No, I rarely, unless I'm in extremely bad wind current like on Lake Erie, I rarely will go heavier than a 1/4 ounce on a drop shot. And again, the lighter line makes it much easier to use a lighter weight. Current doesn't affect 4-pound test nearly as much as it does 8-pound test. So you can use Smackdown. Seaguar Smackdown braid is so small that the current doesn't affect it nearly like it would. You know, there's a huge difference between throwing that and throwing 6-pound fluoro. So I typically will use 1/4 ounce and under. Very rarely will I go heavier than that, regardless of how much the current's playing a role in it.
In how you fish offshore deep water in southern lakes versus northern lakes for pre-spawn?
Give me that again. You broke up.
Any different? Do you fish any differently for southern lakes for pre-spawn than you do in northern lakes, or does it work pretty much the same?
No, I think that it fishes pretty much the same. One point that I forgot to bring up, a lot of times we view depth as, why does that fish go to 40 foot, or why does he go to 20 foot? Every lake is a little bit different, but it is all about where the cover is. And there are lakes throughout the south and in the north, all through the country, that the deepest really available cover is going to be 25 to 30 feet. There are lakes where the deepest available cover, and what I mean by that is if you have a lake that anything over 25 foot is just a straight down drop to the channel, then you're really not going to want to fish that. But if you have big flats, you have some contour out to 40 or 50 feet, regardless whether you're in Maine or you're in Alabama, it doesn't make any difference. Those fish will like that regardless of where they are in the country. I fish them both the same.
More of a local question. So Carrie asked, he's fishing Lanier, and they're having a tough time catching bigger fish in deep water. Any suggestions?
Well, one thing that I would suggest is try a different bait. I don't know what he's throwing. Maybe he'll ask you another question, but with a swim bait, if I'm in, or actually a casting spoon is another, a crocodile spoon, one of the big Strike King sexy spoons. If I'm in an area where I'm not catching big fish and they're schooled up, I can see them on a depth finder, I'll definitely make a bait switch to use a bigger bait. If that doesn't work, then I'm out of there and looking, I'm moving on. Typically fish will school with the same size. It's not always the case, but it's typical. So if you're catching 2-pounders and you're catching a lot of them, you're probably in the wrong spot. But I would suggest looking for those, what we talked about, some of that less obvious breaks. Those are where some of the bigger fish will stay. Big fish are spookier than small fish, so if they start getting pressured, the first ones to move off are going to be the biggest fish. So that's how I would typically handle that.
Particular break that you find big fish cater to more than another break?
A typical break, is that what the question was?
Is one break better than another break? In other words, I guess what they're asking is, do you find bigger fish on one certain break and more fish on another?
That depends. Yes, I'll answer that this way. If you have a break line in contour that is closer to a creek, absolutely. Just because that there is some contour there doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be fish on it. It's not like Erie. We talked about Erie. Erie is one of those places that bass live everywhere there's rock. They spawn in 30 feet. They live in 30 feet. But on a lake, they're typically going to spawn in these creeks. I mean, there are always some fish that's going to spawn on a main lake, but they're typically going to spawn in a creek. So a break located to a big spawning area is going to be better than a break that isn't. So, and again, that's a starting point. So I would always start looking for break lines that are closer to a big spawning creek, closer to a good feeding area where there may be a shad spawn going on offshore, that type of thing. So yes, there are definitely better areas to look for big fish.
Where you move more towards deep water.
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
Particular water temp that you then move towards deep water more often.
Not necessarily. I mean, you can go by your patterns. Once the water temperature hits 75 to 80, and most of the fish are finished spawning. So, not so much water temp as I do just what stage the fish are in. That's pretty easy to determine just by if you're on a particular lake and you've kept up with the spawn. That's one way of doing it. When you get there, I don't spend a lot of time doing any one particular thing in practice if I'm there for a tournament, because that way I can kind of figure out what phase the fish are in. If I get up there shallow and I think there's a few spawning, I pull in and there's just a few bucks left, then I'll know that those fish are moving out. And the funny thing about the way they migrate is they take a long time to get there, but they don't take very long to get back out to the main river channel. So they'll get deep a lot quicker post-spawn than they move shallow. So water temperature is just more about where they're at in the spawn, but not necessarily. It's just a post-spawn, pre-spawn thing. The temperature is really not as important as you would think.
Key differences between locating smallmouth and largemouth in deeper water.
For me, that's pretty easy. The biggest thing, and it took me a while to learn that, was we touched on that with talking about Lake Erie, is that smallmouth are less concerned with a particular contour than they are big rocky flats, and that is in any lake in the country. If you go to Kentucky Lake and you want to target smallmouth, if you can find those deep rock flats, they're always better than looking for just a specific spot. Smallmouths are a much bigger sight feeder than they are an ambush feeder. A largemouth is typically an ambush feeder. They'll sit on a point, wait for bait to come by. Not to say they won't school on shad, they typically do, but they're just programmed more to be an ambush feeder, where a smallmouth hunts its food down. So they need bigger areas to roam. Big flats, big rocky flats, and they don't necessarily have to be deep, but just as long as they have somewhere they can roam around and hunt down their food, makes it easier to locate smallmouth. So they definitely cohabitate some of the same areas, but typically with smallmouth, I would much prefer to look for them on big flats, whether deep or shallow.
Do you pay much attention to thermoclines?
That depends. As a biologist, I've done some testing and worked with the DNR. We tested a lake, I think it was last summer or the summer before, where the oxygen, the DO level below 8 feet was non-existent. So there was no oxygen available in that lake below 8 feet. But now this was definitely not typical. It was a small, had very little current, kind of a bowl type lake. So there wasn't like you would see on the Tennessee River, but somewhere like on the Tennessee River or any of the lakes that have a lot of current, no, I don't pay any attention to the thermocline at all. It's generally going to be a little deeper than what I want to look for anyway. It's going to be 50 plus, not always, but typically. In a lake that has any current, I just don't think it plays that big a part in it.
And as we're about out of time, how does water clarity affect how deep you go?
It definitely does, especially pre-spawn. Fish that on a muddier lake that would set up in 10 to 20, on a really clear lake like Table Rock, Bull Shoals, Smith Lake, Smith Mountain Lake, they'll set up deeper. You can find them staging to pre-spawn because those fish may spawn in 20 feet. They'll set in 35 or 40 on a really clear lake. The deepest tournament I won, though, was Douglas. Now, that was post-spawn fish, but those fish were, that deep, and it's not a real clear lake. But typically speaking, you can definitely assume when you get there that clear water, you can set up a lot deeper.
There were a lot of questions on particular lakes, and I apologize that we weren't able to get to specific lakes, but hopefully this helped everyone. We are about out of time. Just want to let everyone know that we do have this on record, and to please check the Navionics website and the Bass Pro Source One website probably come Monday or Tuesday, and you'll be able to review this and see the webinar to make any notes that you might have missed or just to review it for knowledge. So I want to thank everybody for joining. Jeremy, thank you very much for taking time out tonight to help everybody with a little more knowledge on bass in deep water.
Thank you, and thank everybody for joining.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.